Snow was swallowing a small Vermont town when an elderly couple stepped into a diner, soaked, trembling, and too ashamed to ask for help. Most people looked away, but a retired Navy SEAL noticed the bruise on the woman's wrist, and his German Shepherd, Bear, sensed something even darker. When a gray pickup rolled past the diner, Bear's low growl told Jack one thing: the storm outside wasn't the only danger coming for them. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from in the comments, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more inspiring stories of faith, kindness, and loyal dogs. Snow buried Maple Ridge beneath a white silence that morning, turning the narrow Vermont streets into pale rivers of ice and breath. Outside the Pine Lantern Diner, beneath a sagging green awning rimmed with icicles, Harold Bennett stood with one hand wrapped around a worn wooden cane and the other gripping a faded canvas bag as if it held the last pieces of his life. He was 83, tall once, but age had folded his shoulders forward like an old roof under too many winters. His face was long and weathered, carved with the hard lines of a man who had spent most of his life measuring lumber, climbing ladders, and building houses for other families to grow old inside. A thin ring of white hair clung to his head beneath a soaked wool cap, and his gray eyes still carried the stubborn dignity of a craftsman who hated needing help. Beside him, Martha Bennett trembled in a brown winter coat too light for the storm. She was 80, small-boned and gentle-faced, with silver hair tucked under a knitted hat and soft blue eyes that looked as if they had learned to apologize before asking for anything. Her gloved fingers clutched Harold's sleeve, not only for balance, but for courage. The snow had soaked through the hems of their coats. Their shoes were wet. Their breath came in thin, tired clouds. Still, Harold stared through the diner window with the cautious hope of a man who had been turned away too many times and feared one more refusal might break something inside him. Inside, warmth gathered under yellow lights. The Pine Lantern smelled of fried bacon, maple syrup, coffee, and old wood polished by decades of elbows and winter mornings. At a corner booth near the frosted window sat Jack Miller, 39, broad-shouldered and still-backed, with the quiet posture of a man trained never to waste movement. He wore a dark field jacket over a gray sweater, his short brown hair brushed back without vanity, his jaw clean-shaven but tense, and his hazel eyes watched the room with calm distance. Jack had served as a Navy SEAL for years before returning home to Vermont, though returning had never felt like the right word. His body had come back. Some quieter part of him still seemed posted in distant sand, dark water, and places where good men learned to sleep lightly. He came to the diner most mornings because routine was easier than peace. A cup of black coffee sat before him, untouched and cooling, a small black pond where his reflection looked older than it should have. Under the table lay Bear, his 5-year-old German Shepherd, a powerful black and tan dog with a broad chest, alert ears, and amber eyes too intelligent to be mistaken for simple obedience. Bear had worked beside Jack in dangerous places, trained to read tension in a room before voices rose, to smell fear beneath perfume and wool, to understand that danger often arrived smiling. That morning, Bear had been resting with his muzzle on his paws, but when the diner door opened and the storm breathed in, he lifted his head. Harold stepped inside first, guiding Martha through the gust. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes like tiny white moths. A few customers glanced up, then quickly returned to their plates, their phones, their safe little worlds. Harold removed his cap with stiff fingers and approached the nearest table, where 2 middle-aged women sat with half-finished pancakes and matching expressions of polite discomfort. "Excuse me," he said, voice rough but courteous. "Would you mind if my wife sat for just a minute? She's had a hard walk." The women exchanged a look. One shifted her purse onto the empty chair. "We're waiting for someone," she said, though the words had no strength behind them. Harold nodded as if the answer had been kind. "Of course. Sorry to bother you." He turned, but Martha swayed. It was a small movement, hardly more than the surrender of tired knees, yet Jack saw it the way he saw a tripwire in old memory. His chair scraped back. In 3 strides, he was beside her, one hand steadying her elbow, the other hovering near her shoulder without grabbing. "I've got you, ma'am," he said. His voice was low, firm, and oddly gentle, like a door closing softly against a storm. Martha looked up at him, embarrassed and grateful all at once. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't usually fall apart in public." "Then we'll call it bad weather," Jack said. "Not falling apart." He led them to his booth without asking permission from the room. Harold tried to protest, pride rising like an old soldier from a chair. "Son, we can't take your table." Jack lifted his coffee mug and moved it aside. "You just did." There was no boast in him, only certainty. Martha lowered herself into the seat with a faint sigh that sounded almost like pain leaving her body. Bear came forward slowly, not crowding, not begging, only watching. His ears tipped toward Martha, his tail moved once, a careful sweep. "That's Bear," Jack said. "He's friendly unless the world gives him a reason not to be." Martha smiled for the first time, small and fragile. "A wise policy." Harold gave a dry chuckle, but his hand still shook on the canvas bag. Jack noticed the bag was old, patched at one corner, and held against Harold's chest like a shield. He noticed Martha keeping her right hand tucked beneath her sleeve. He noticed the way both of them sat too straight, too polite, as though taking up space required forgiveness. When Martha finally eased off one glove to wrap her fingers around the warm mug Jack had pushed toward her, her sleeve slipped back. Purple bruising circled her wrist in the uneven shape of fingers. Jack's eyes stilled. Martha saw him see it. Panic flickered across her face so quickly another man might have missed it. She tugged the sleeve down and folded both hands in her lap. "I slipped last week," she said softly. "Old bones and icy steps make poor partners." Harold looked at her, then away, pain moving under his expression like a shadow beneath lake ice. Jack did not challenge her. Not yet. He had learned that frightened people guarded the truth the way children guarded candle flames. Push too hard, and the light went out. Bear stepped closer to Martha and lowered his head onto her shoe. Warm and heavy, a silent oath made in fur and breath. Her fingers trembled, then rested between his ears. For one quiet second, the diner's noise faded around them. Then Bear's body tightened. His ears rose. A low growl rolled from his chest, deep enough to make Jack's hand move instinctively toward him. Bear was no longer looking at Martha. He was staring through the fogged front window, where a broad, blurred figure stood almost hidden in the falling snow. The growl stayed under Bear's breath like distant thunder, low enough not to startle the whole diner, but deep enough to make Jack Miller straighten in his seat. Outside the fogged window, the blurred figure shifted behind the curtain of snow, then passed slowly beyond the glass and vanished toward the street. For a moment, no one spoke. Martha Bennett's hand froze in the fur between Bear's ears, and Harold's fingers tightened around the handle of his canvas bag until the old knuckles shone pale. Jack watched the window, then the door, then Bear. The dog did not bark. He simply remained standing, body angled between the Bennetts and the entrance, his amber eyes narrowed with the ancient seriousness of a guardian carved from winter itself. "Bear," Jack murmured, calm but firm. The German shepherd's ears flicked, yet he did not fully relax. At the counter, a young waitress had noticed the tension. She came over carrying a small tray with 2 mugs of tea, a plate of warm bread, and a face that tried to be cheerful without being careless. "I thought you folks could use something hot," she said softly. Her name tag read Emma. Emma Collins was 27, slender but strong in the practical way of women who spent long shifts on their feet, with auburn hair tied in a loose braid, freckled fair skin, and green eyes that seemed too gentle for the hard winters she had already survived. She had moved back to Maple Ridge after her mother's stroke 2 years earlier, and that season of hospitals, unpaid bills, and quiet fear had given her a tenderness toward old people that was not pity, but recognition. She set the tea before Harold and Martha as if placing candles before saints. "No charge," she added quickly, seeing Harold's mouth open. "It's left over from the breakfast rush, And if I don't give it to someone, Frank in the kitchen will turn it into some kind of tragic soup experiment." Martha gave a small laugh, thin as cracked glass, but real. "Then you've saved us from the soup, dear." Emma smiled, and for the first time the booth felt less like a hiding place and more like shelter. Harold lifted the mug with both hands, pretending the tremor came from cold alone. Jack saw the performance and respected it enough not to name it. The old man had the posture of someone trying to keep a ruined house standing through sheer dignity. His coat was worn at the elbows, his shoes had salt stains up the sides, and the canvas bag beside him was patched with careful stitches, the kind made by hands that could no longer afford to replace what they loved. Martha tore a piece of bread, but did not eat at first. She watched the steam rise from her tea as though it might tell her what to say. Jack waited. Silence, he had learned, could be a key if held long enough. Bear lowered himself beside Martha's feet, but his head remained lifted, his body pointed toward the door. Emma lingered near the booth, one hand tucked into the pocket of her apron. "You're the Bennetts, aren't you?" she asked gently. Harold looked up, surprised. "Used to be more people knew that." "My dad did," Emma said. "He said Mr. Bennett built half the porches in Maple Ridge before I was born. Said your porch railings never wobbled, even when the rest of the house gave up." Something almost like pride moved across Harold's face, then disappeared under shame. "A porch ought to hold," he said. "People lean on it when they're tired." Jack heard more in that sentence than Harold meant to give. Martha finally raised the cup to her lips, but her right wrist betrayed her, stiffening under the sleeve. Jack's eyes dropped only for a second. She noticed. Again, that quick, frightened smile appeared, the one people use when they are sweeping broken glass under a rug before guests come in. "It really was the ice," she whispered. Harold closed his eyes. A long breath left him. "Martha," he said, not scolding, not even correcting, just grieving. Her lips trembled. "We don't need to trouble this man." "You're not troubling me," Jack said, "and you don't owe me the truth. But if someone is looking for you, I need to know whether to keep my dog by your feet or at the door." Bear's tail gave one slow thump, as if agreeing with the chain of command. The words changed something. Harold looked toward the front window, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "His name is Ryan Bennett," he said. "Our grandson." Martha's fingers closed around her cup so tightly Jack worried the porcelain might crack. Harold continued, each word pulled from him like a nail from old wood. "He's 44 now, big fellow, sandy hair, broad shoulders, always had his father's jaw and his mother's smile when he wanted something. When our daughter Laura died, he came to us saying family should look after family." Harold swallowed. "We believed him because grief makes fools of the faithful." Jack did not interrupt. He pictured the kind of man Harold described, strong enough to move furniture, charming enough to get signatures, cruel enough to call control love. Martha spoke next, her voice almost lost beneath the diner's clatter. "At first, he fixed things, the back steps, the furnace. He drove us to appointments. He called me Grandma Marty like he did when he was little." Her eyes clouded with the ache of remembering the child inside the man who had hurt her. "Then he said the bank was confusing us, then the mail, then the phone. He said people were trying to scam us, and maybe they were, but after a while the only voice we heard was his." Harold's jaw tightened. "He took the checkbook, said it was easier if he handled the pension, had papers drawn up so he could help with decisions. I signed some. I was tired. Martha had been sick that spring." He looked down at his hands that had once framed houses and now shook around a mug of tea. A man spends his life building doors, then signs one paper and finds himself locked behind them. Emma's expression had gone still. She glanced toward Jack, horror and anger mixing in her green eyes, but she said nothing. She understood instinctively that the booth had become a confessional. Martha reached into the pocket of her damp coat and drew out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. She unfolded it just enough for Jack to see a thin gold wedding ring, worn smooth by nearly 60 years of marriage. He wanted to sell it, she said. Said gold was wasted sitting in a drawer. Her voice broke, but she steadied it with the last stubborn thread of pride. Harold hid it for me behind a loose board in the pantry. Last night, when everything happened, he found it before we left. Harold opened the canvas bag and showed Jack a faded photograph in a cracked wooden frame. A modest white farmhouse with blue shutters, a wide porch, and two younger versions of Harold and Martha standing beside a newly planted maple tree. They looked sunlit, almost mythic in their happiness, like two ordinary people blessed before the gods remembered to test them. "That house was ours," Harold said. "Built the porch myself. Laura took that picture the year before she got sick." Jack studied the photo, then the couple before him. He felt an old coldness moving through his chest. Not fear, but fury forced into discipline. He had seen enemies wear uniforms. He had seen them hide in alleys, in compounds, in the smoke beyond broken walls. But this kind of enemy sat at family tables, used old nicknames, learned which wounds to press, and called theft responsibility. "What happened last night?" Jack asked quietly. Martha flinched at the question. Harold looked at her, and when she nodded faintly, he answered. "Ryan came home drunk. The storm had knocked branches onto the driveway, and he was mad about the heating bill. Said we were costing him everything. Said if we wanted to act helpless, we could freeze like helpless people." Martha's hand moved unconsciously to her wrist. "He threw a mug," she whispered. "It hit the wall near the stove. I tried to pick up the pieces, and he grabbed me. Harold told him to let go." Harold stared at the table. "I had my cane. Thought I could still scare a man with it." His mouth twisted with bitter humor. "Turns out, age makes a poor sword." "No," Jack said, his voice low. "Age makes a poor shield. That's different." Emma wiped quickly beneath one eye and pretended it was steam from the tea. The diner around them continued its small morning rituals. Forks tapping plates, a bell ringing for orders, boots stamping snow from the mat. It seemed almost offensive that the world could continue while two people quietly confessed to being exiled from their own life. Bear rose suddenly. This time there was no slow warning. His ears shot forward, shoulders tightening, paws planted wide. Jack followed his gaze. Through the diner window, a gray pickup rolled past at a crawl, its tires cutting dark lines through the snow along the curb. The truck was battered along the passenger side, with a cracked right headlight and a strip of black tape holding part of the side mirror in place. It moved too slowly for the road, too deliberately for the weather. Jack could not see the driver clearly, only the suggestion of a large figure behind the windshield, one hand high on the wheel. Bear gave one sharp, contained bark. The sound sliced through the booth. Martha's face drained of color. Harold turned toward the window, and the old pride finally fell away, leaving naked fear beneath it. The gray truck passed the diner, then slowed near the corner as if deciding whether to circle back. Jack kept one hand on Bear's collar, not to restrain him from violence, but to steady the promise in his body. "Harold," he said, still watching the truck, "do you know that vehicle?" Harold's lips parted. For a moment, no sound came. Then he gripped the canvas bag against his chest, eyes fixed on the disappearing taillights, and whispered, "That's Ryan's truck. Gee." The gray pickup disappeared around the corner, but it left fear behind like tire tracks in fresh snow. Harold Bennett kept staring through the diner window long after the taillights were gone, his face drained of its old carpenter's color, his lips pressed together so tightly they seemed carved into him. Martha sat beside him with one hand buried in Bear's thick fur, and Jack Miller could feel the room changing around them. The diner was still warm, still bright, still smelling of coffee and browned butter, but the booth had become a small island surrounded by a dark sea. Emma Collins looked toward the window, then back at Jack, her young face caught between worry and determination. "You can't let them walk back out there," she said quietly, the softness in her voice now sharpened by something braver. Jack had already made the decision before she finished. Men like Ryan did not drive slowly past windows by accident. Men like Ryan circled what they believed belonged to them. Jack stood, reached for his coat, and looked at Harold. "There's a lodge 2 streets over. Quiet place. I'll get you there." Harold opened his mouth, prepared by habit to refuse kindness before kindness could become debt, but Martha touched his sleeve. That small touch silenced him more effectively than any command. She was tired down to the bone, not only from the walk through snow, but from years of shrinking herself so one angry man could feel large. "We don't have money for a room," she whispered. "You have enough trouble," Jack said. "The room is mine to worry about." Emma moved quickly, as if afraid time itself might betray them. She returned with a paper bag folded at the top, steam curling faintly from inside. "Soup," she said, pressing it into Martha's hands. Then, after a nervous glance toward the counter, she slipped a pale blue sweater into the old woman's canvas bag. "It was my mother's. She won't mind. She always said clothes are supposed to go where they're needed." Martha looked down at the sweater, and the gratitude that crossed her face was almost too painful to watch. "Dear girl," she said, but the rest of her thanks caught in her throat. Emma only shook her head, blinking hard. "Go before he comes back." Jack laid a few bills on the table, clipped Bear's leash, and guided the Bennetts toward the side door instead of the front. It was a small, tactical choice, one his body made before his mind named it. The storm struck them at once. Wind swept snow under the awning and slapped cold across their faces. Bear went first, nose lifted, shoulders tense, reading the white air. Jack's truck waited in the narrow side lot, a dark Ford with salt along the wheel wells and a cracked leather interior that smelled faintly of pine, dog fur, and old coffee. He opened the back passenger door. "Bear, up!" The German shepherd jumped in smoothly, then turned in place so he could face the rear window. Harold helped Martha climb into the front passenger seat, careful with the bag and the soup, careful with her coat, careful with every part of her as if apology lived in his hands. Jack noticed that too. Old love was not loud. Sometimes it was simply a man shielding his wife's fingers from a metal door handle in January. Once they were inside, Jack started the engine. The heater coughed, groaned, then began pushing thin warmth into the cab. Pine Lantern Diner glowed behind them as they pulled away, a lantern indeed, shrinking in the mirror like the last safe fire before a long road. For the first minute, no one spoke. The tires rolled over packed snow with a soft grinding sound. Maple Ridge's main street was nearly empty. Shop windows were frosted. Flags snapped stiffly from porch posts, and the old church bell tower rose in the white haze like a watchman too tired to call warnings anymore. Bear sat upright in the rear seat, his amber eyes fixed through the back glass. Every few seconds his ears twitched, first left, then right, as if the storm carried messages meant only for him. Martha held the paper bag on her lap. The smell of soup filled the cab, warm and homely, almost cruel in its contrast to the fear sitting beside it. "Maybe he was just passing," Harold said at last. It was the kind of sentence a man says not because he believes it, but because his wife needs to hear the world can still be reasonable. Jack glanced at the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared 3 blocks back, pale and blurred through the snowfall. They slowed when Jack slowed. They turned when Jack turned. "Maybe," Jack said. His voice gave nothing away. Martha's fingers tightened around Harold's hand. Bear gave a low huff, then stood with his front paws braced against the floorboard, nose close to the rear window. The headlights gained ground. Jack took a right onto County Road 9, away from the center of town and toward the older part of Maple Ridge where the houses sat farther apart and the pines grew close to the road. The truck behind them followed. "Jack?" Martha said, though they had not known each other long enough for first names to feel safe. Fear makes introductions faster than friendship. "I see him," Jack replied. Harold twisted carefully in his seat, squinting through the fogged glass. The lines around his mouth deepened. "Gray, pickup," he murmured. Cracked headlight. Martha closed her eyes. "Ryan." The name entered the cab like another person. Jack's jaw tightened. Ryan Bennett was no longer only a story told over cooling tea. He was behind them, wrapped in steel, anger, and entitlement. Jack increased speed slightly, not enough to panic the old couple, enough to measure the response. The gray pickup answered by closing the distance. Its high beams flashed once, a white blast across the mirrors. Martha flinched. Harold muttered something under his breath that might have been a prayer or a curse from a younger decade. Then the horn sounded, long and aggressive, tearing through the snowfall. Bear barked once, sharp as a rifle crack. Jack kept both hands on the wheel. Seat belts tight. The road curved downhill where black ice often hid beneath the powder. Jack eased the Ford through it with careful pressure, refusing to be baited into speed. Behind them, Ryan's pickup swerved closer, its engine roaring. The gray shape filled the mirror, then dropped back, then surged again. A second horn blast came. A moment later, the pickup swung left as if to pass, though the road was barely wide enough for two vehicles and the snowbanks rose hard on either side. "He'll hit us," Martha whispered. "No," Jack said. Not a promise, a verdict. Bear suddenly lunged toward the left rear window, barking with furious urgency. In that instant, Jack saw what Bear had seen first. Ryan's pickup was not trying to pass. It was angling toward the Ford's rear quarter, trying to shove them toward the ditch just as the road bent near a stand of black pines. Jack turned into the slide before the impact could happen, feathered the brake, then cut sharply onto a narrow forest road half hidden by snow. The Ford lurched, Harold's cane clattered against the door, and Martha gasped as pine branches scraped along the side panels like fingernails of some winter beast. The gray pickup overshot the turn for half a second, then corrected violently and followed. Jack knew the road. It was an old service route used in summer by loggers and hunters, narrow, uneven, and dangerous in weather like this. But it also looped past a frozen creek and climbed toward a clearing where a man could stop with room to maneuver. If Ryan wanted a confrontation, Jack preferred choosing the ground. Bear's growl deepened behind him. Snow struck the windshield in thick bursts. The wipers fought and fought again. The world narrowed to headlights, tree trunks, and the red pulse of danger in the mirror. "He thinks we belong to him," Harold said suddenly, voice shaking with old rage. "That's what this is. Not love, not duty, ownership." Martha looked at her husband, and some weary veil lifted from her eyes. "Then maybe today he hears no." The words were quiet, but Jack felt them. Even Bear seemed to, his bark cutting off into a tense silence. The forest road climbed, curved, then opened into a small white clearing where tire ruts crossed beneath a line of frozen maples. Jack slowed to turn through it, but Ryan made his move first. The gray pickup roared past on the left, fishtailed wildly, then swung sideways across the road ahead. Snow exploded under its tires. Jack braked hard. The Ford slid several feet, then stopped with less than a car length between them. For one suspended heartbeat, nothing moved except snow and breath. Then the driver's door of the pickup flew open. Ryan Bennett stepped out. He was 44, broad and heavy in the shoulders, with sandy brown hair plastered damply to his forehead and a hard, square face that might once have been handsome before resentment bloated it. A rough beard darkened his jaw, uneven and neglected, and a pale scar cut through one eyebrow, giving his stare a permanent tilt of accusation. His coat hung open despite the cold, revealing a flannel shirt stretched across his chest, and the way he moved, too fast, too loose, told Jack the man had been drinking. Ryan slammed the door hard enough to shake snow from the roof of the pickup. "Get out!" he shouted. "All of you!" Jack turned to the Bennetts. "Stay in the truck!" Then he opened his door. Bear was out before Jack could give the command, landing in the snow beside him, hackles raised but body controlled. Ryan pointed past Jack toward the cab. "Those are my grandparents. My responsibility. You don't know a thing about this family." Harold opened the passenger door despite Martha's whispered protest. He did not step out, but his voice carried through the wind. "You lost the right to call it family when you threw us into the storm." Ryan's face twisted. "I kept you alive, old man. I paid bills. I fed you. I kept that house standing while you two forgot what day it was." Martha, pale but steady, leaned into view. "You kept the keys, Ryan, not the house." That struck him harder than shouting would have. He lunged toward the Ford, arm outstretched, as if he might drag the truth back into submission by force. "You're coming home now." Jack moved first, placing himself in Ryan's path. Bear moved with him, a dark and gold wall of muscle and warning. Ryan tried to step around, reaching toward Martha's open door. Bear sprang forward and planted himself between them, not biting, not attacking, only unleashing a growl so deep the forest seemed to hold its breath. Ryan froze. Snow collected on Bear's ears. His teeth showed white beneath a lifted lip, and his amber eyes did not blink. Jack's voice was calm, quiet, and colder than the storm. He looked straight into Ryan's bloodshot eyes and said, "They are not your property." Ryan Bennett stood in the snowfall with Bear's growl still vibrating through the frozen air, his face flushed with whiskey, humiliation, and the fury of a man who had finally met a door that would not open for him. For several seconds, he did not move. His eyes jumped from Jack Miller's steady face to the German shepherd planted before him, then to Harold and Martha inside the truck, where two old souls sat pale, but no longer completely alone. "This isn't over," Ryan hissed, though the words came out weaker than he intended. Jack did not answer. He simply held Ryan's stare until the bigger man stepped backward, cursing under his breath, then climbed into the gray pickup and tore away down the forest road, his tires spitting snow like a wounded beast retreating into the trees. Only when the taillights disappeared did Jack guide Bear back into the Ford and drive toward the safer lights of town. Nobody spoke for a while. Harold kept one arm around the canvas bag, the old photograph pressed close to his chest. Martha stared straight ahead, her lips moving faintly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in the kind of silent counting people use to prove they are still alive after fear has passed. Bear sat behind them, restless but controlled, nose near the rear window, refusing to trust the darkness. By the time they reached the small roadside inn called Dawson House, night had lowered itself over Maple Ridge like a heavy quilt. The place sat at the edge of town beneath 3 snow-covered maples, a narrow 2-story building painted cream with green shutters and a porch lamp that glowed soft gold against the storm. Its owner, Linda Dawson, opened the door before Jack could knock twice. Linda was 66, a widow with a round, kind face, warm brown skin, silver curls pinned loosely at the back of her head, and the firm shoulders of a woman who had spent half her life carrying grief without letting it sour her. Her husband had died 12 winters earlier after a logging accident, and since then she had turned the old house into an inn for travelers, church guests, stranded truckers, and occasionally people who needed more than a bed. She looked at Martha's trembling hands, Harold's wet coat, Jack's guarded eyes, and Bear standing like a soldier beside them. She asked no foolish questions. "Room 3, she said, stepping aside. "It's warm, and there's a kettle. Dog's welcome if he wipes his paws better than most men." Even Harold, exhausted and ashamed, managed a faint smile at that. The room was simple, but clean, with flowered curtains, 2 twin beds, a wooden dresser, and a small lamp that spread amber light over the quilted blankets. To the Bennetts, it might as well have been a cathedral. Martha lowered herself onto the nearest bed and touched the blanket as if it were something holy. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Linda set a hand on her shoulder, gentle but not sentimental. "You can thank me by drinking something warm and not apologizing for needing help." That was the first thing that broke Martha. Not the chase, not Ryan's shouting, not even the bruise on her wrist. It was the plain permission to be cared for. Tears slid down her face, silent at first, then shaking loose from somewhere deep and old. Harold sat beside her, one hand covering his eyes, and Jack looked away because some grief deserved privacy even in a room full of rescuers. An hour later, Emma Collins arrived after her shift, cheeks red from the cold, carrying 2 grocery bags, a bundle of scarves, and the stubborn brightness of someone who had decided kindness was not a feeling, but a task. "I brought chili, bread, socks, and an ugly green hat," she announced softly, trying to make Martha laugh. "The hat is optional unless the storm gets worse. Then fashion dies for the greater good." Martha laughed through her tears, and the sound changed the room. Bear accepted a piece of bread from Emma with grave royal dignity, then returned to his post by the door. While Linda helped Martha into the pale blue sweater Emma had given her, Jack stepped into the hallway and made a call he had hoped never to make for something like this. Tom Walker answered on the third ring. Tom was 42, an old friend from Jack's military years, now a private investigator in Burlington. In Jack's memory, Tom had always been lean and restless, with dark blonde hair cut short, a narrow face, sharp blue eyes, and the dry humor of a man who trusted facts more than promises. He had left the service after an injury ended his deployment days, but instead of letting bitterness hollow him out, he had built a new life, finding paper trails, missing people, hidden money, and lies dressed in legal language. "Miller," Tom said, his voice rough with surprise. "Either you miss my charming personality, or something's burning." Jack glanced back at the room where Martha was holding a bowl of chili with both hands. Elder abuse, financial control, possible forged documents. Grandson's name is Ryan Bennett. Victims are Harold and Martha Bennett, Maple Ridge. The humor vanished from Tom's voice. "How bad?" "Bad enough that he chased them through a snowstorm." A chair creaked on Tom's end. "Send me birth dates if you have them. I'll start with property records, pension deposits, recent transfers, and court filings. Don't let them go anywhere alone." Jack gave him what information Harold could remember. 20 minutes later, Tom called back and his voice had gone colder. "You've got smoke and fire. Harold's pension has been drained in scheduled withdrawals. The farmhouse title was transferred to Ryan 8 months ago under a family care agreement. There's also a pending land sale inquiry attached to the property. No final signature yet, but it's moving." Jack closed his eyes briefly. He had expected ugliness. Still, expectation did not make it easier. "Can we stop it?" "Not with anger," Tom said. "With evidence. Medical records, photos of injuries, statements, proof of coercion, and anything from inside that house showing confinement or neglect. I'm connecting you with Rebecca Hayes." The name struck Jack like an old bell. Rebecca Hayes was 41, a senior rights attorney from Montpelier and a former Navy legal officer, tall and composed, with dark brown hair usually cut just below her chin, olive skin, and gray eyes that made dishonest men feel smaller before she opened a file. She had become relentless after her own father, a retired firefighter, was nearly cheated out of his home by a predatory caregiver. Her voice came through the phone 5 minutes later, clear, precise, and calm enough to make panic seem undisciplined. "Mr. Miller, Tom gave me the bones. I need the flesh." "Are the Bennetts safe tonight?" "Yes." "Good. Tomorrow morning, clinic first. We document every bruise and every sign of stress or neglect. Then we talk to the sheriff. If the house contains what I suspect it contains, we move fast. Do not confront Ryan again unless forced. Bullies are useful when they shout, but dangerous when they start thinking." Jack looked toward Bear, still awake at the door. "Understood." After the call, he returned to the room. Martha was quieter now. She reached into the pocket of her old coat and placed the wedding ring in Jack's palm. In the lamplight, it looked almost weightless. A small circle of gold polished by decades of dishes, church mornings, garden soil, and Harold's hand searching for hers in the dark. "Ryan said it was just metal," she said. "But this is the last thing he didn't get to name for me. Harold took it back before we left. I want you to hold it tonight, because if he comes, he'll look for it." Jack closed his fingers around the ring carefully, as if accepting a sacred relic from a queen disguised as a tired grandmother. "He won't touch it," he said. Near midnight, the inn settled into creaks and wind. Linda had gone downstairs, Emma had finally left after promising to return in the morning, and Harold and Martha slept uneasily beneath separate quilts, their hands still linked between the beds. Jack sat in a chair near the window, awake, with Bear lying across the doorway. Then the dog's ears rose, his head lifted slowly, a growl gathered in his chest. Jack stood without a sound, crossed to the window, and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. Fresh footprints marked the snow beneath the glass. Not old, not wind-softened. New. Jack's gaze lifted to the window pane, where trembling letters had been traced through the frost by a finger from outside. Come home, or lose everything. Morning came to Maple Ridge pale and brittle, with snow packed against the roads and a weak gray light lying over the town like ash. By sunrise, the message on the Dawson house window had frozen into the glass, each letter stiff and cruel beneath a thin skin of ice. Come home, or lose everything. Jack Miller photographed it before Linda wiped the window clean, and he said nothing while Martha Bennett sat on the edge of the bed with both hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor as if Ryan's words had crawled into the room and taken a chair. Harold stood beside her, still in yesterday's clothes, his canvas bag clutched against his ribs. The old photograph of their farmhouse peeked from the opening like a little window into a life stolen from them. Bear remained by the door, broad body stretched across the threshold, ears awake even when his eyes looked calm. Jack had seen men threaten with guns, knives, law, money, silence. Ryan's threat was uglier because it knew exactly where to cut. Home was not a building to Harold and Martha. It was memory with walls. Rebecca Hayes arrived before 8 in a dark wool coat dusted with snow, carrying a leather folder and the composed expression of a woman who had turned outrage into profession. She had driven from Montpelier through bad roads without complaint, her dark hair tucked behind one ear, her gray eyes taking in the window, the footprints, Martha's trembling hands, Harold's shame, Jack's guarded stillness. "We start with the clinic," she said, "before Ryan has time to turn bruises into excuses." Her tone was not cold, but it left no room for fear to lead. At the Maple Ridge Family Clinic, Dr. Ellen Price met them near the examination room. She was in her late 50s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with warm beige skin, silver-black hair cut in a practical bob, and rectangular glasses that made her brown eyes look larger and kinder. She had served the town for 20 years, and people trusted her because she never spoke quickly when someone was hurting. A hard childhood with a chronically ill mother had made her patient with pain and impatient with cruelty. "Mrs. Bennett," she said gently, helping Martha onto the examination table, "I'm going to document what I see. You are in control of this room. If you need me to stop, I stop." Martha nodded, but her eyes filled at the word control as though someone had handed her back a small kingdom. The examination took longer than anyone wanted and less time than justice required. Dr. Price found bruising on Martha's wrist, upper arm, and shoulder, marks at different stages of healing, some yellowing at the edges, others dark and recent. She found no pattern consistent with one simple fall. Harold, though less visibly injured, showed signs of mild dehydration, weight loss, poor sleep, and stress so prolonged it had settled into his breathing. "These are not just old age," Dr. Price said quietly after Martha had dressed again. "Old age bends the body. It does not leave finger-shaped bruises." Harold turned his face away. Jack saw his jaw tremble. The old man was not only angry at Ryan, he was angry at himself for not stopping what had happened. Jack understood that kind of guilt. Survivors often dragged chains forged by crimes they did not commit. Rebecca collected the medical report, photographs, and signed statements. Then she called Sheriff Daniel Brooks. Sheriff Brooks met them at the Bennett property an hour later. He was 52, tall and broad through the chest, with close-cropped brown hair going silver at the temples, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a face shaped by wind, responsibility, and too many front porch tragedies. He had grown up in Maple Ridge, lost a younger brother to addiction, and learned early that family matter was sometimes the prettiest mask evil wore. His manner with people was quiet but firm. He believed in paperwork, witnesses, and letting facts walk into the room before emotion kicked the door down. "Rebecca," he greeted, then nodded to Jack. "Mr. Miller. Heard enough this morning to request a search warrant. Judge signed it on medical evidence, threat documentation, and property fraud concerns." Harold stood at the end of the driveway, staring at the farmhouse. It was a white, two-story place with blue shutters faded by weather, a broad porch half buried in snow, and a maple tree in the yard that had grown tall and crooked since the old photograph was taken. Martha's hand slipped into his. Neither of them moved toward the house until Bear stepped ahead, sniffed the air, and looked back once, as if inviting the king and queen of a ruined castle to reclaim the gate. Inside, the house was colder than it should have been. The furnace was running low, barely enough to keep pipes from freezing. Curtains had been pulled tight over the windows, turning noon into dusk. The kitchen smelled of stale beer, old grease, and damp wood. Bills lay scattered across the dining table, some stamped final notice, others opened and marked with Ryan's angry pen strokes. A framed family photo sat face down near the sink. Martha made a small sound when she saw it. Rebecca photographed everything. Tom Walker moved methodically through the rooms, lean body bent over drawers and file boxes, his blue eyes sharp behind the exhaustion of too little sleep. "This place tells on him," Tom muttered. "Men like Ryan always think intimidation is louder than evidence. It isn't." In a small office off the kitchen, he found folders labeled with Harold's pension number, Martha's insurance papers, property transfer forms, and a pending land sale agreement with a regional development company. Several signatures looked shaky, uneven, and wrong. Rebecca's mouth tightened. "He didn't just take control," she said. "He was preparing to erase them." Upstairs, the air grew colder. The first bedroom held dusty boxes and old quilts. The second smelled of damp fabric and fear. Its door was closed, but what stopped everyone was not the door itself. It was the sliding bolt mounted on the outside. Sheriff Brooks stared at it for a long second, and the easy small-town softness left his face. "That lock wasn't put there for privacy," he said. One deputy forced it open. The room beyond was small and dim. Two narrow beds stood against opposite walls. A tray sat on the floor with a hardened bowl of oatmeal and a plastic cup. The single window had been nailed shut from the outside, the heads of the nails visible through cracked paint. Near one bed, the wooden floor bore long, pale scratches, thin and desperate, as if the tip of Harold's cane had scraped there again and again during nights when no one answered. Martha covered her mouth. Harold gripped the doorframe so hard Jack thought his fingers might split. "He said it was safer," Harold whispered. "Said we wandered." Rebecca's eyes softened for them, then hardened for Ryan. "No," she said. "He caged you." Tom found the recorder behind a loose drawer panel in the little nightstand. Martha stared at it as though seeing an old friend rise from the grave. "I hid it there," she said. "I forgot if it still worked." It worked! Sheriff Brooks pressed play and Ryan's voice filled the room, thick with drink and rage. "You sign when I tell you to sign. You think anyone's going to believe two confused old fools over me?" Then a crash. Martha crying, Harold shouting Ryan's name. Another burst. "That land is mine now. You cost me enough." The recording ended in static, but the silence after it was louder than the shouting. Rebecca sealed the recorder in an evidence bag. "This is enough for emergency protective action," she said. Downstairs, another deputy called from the porch. The gray pickup was turning into the driveway. Ryan Bennett came out of the storm like a man arriving to defend a throne he had built from theft. His face was red, his coat open, his boots slipping on the snowy path as he charged toward the porch. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" he roared. Harold flinched at the word "my." Martha did not. Something in the room with the locked door had burned fear down into anger. Rebecca stepped onto the porch holding the evidence folder. "Mr. Bennett, this property is under investigation for elder abuse, fraud, and unlawful confinement." Ryan lunged toward her, grabbing for the folder. Bear moved first. The German shepherd placed himself between Rebecca and Ryan, chest forward, teeth just visible. a living wall of judgment. Ryan froze, then looked past him at Harold and Martha. "You did this," he spat. Sheriff Brooks stepped behind him, took his wrist and turned him firmly toward the rail. "Ryan Bennett, you're under arrest." The cuffs clicked shut in the winter air. Harold stood at the foot of the porch, staring at the blue shutters, the sagging steps, the maple tree he had planted when hope was young. His voice came out barely above a breath. "It used to be our home." The county courthouse stood under a colorless winter sky, its brick walls darkened by melting snow and its tall windows reflecting a town that had finally begun to look directly at what it once ignored. Inside, the hallway smelled of floor wax, wet wool, and old paper. Harold Bennett walked slowly beside Martha, one hand on his cane, the other tucked around her elbow with the careful devotion of a man who had nearly lost the right to protect what he loved. His best shirt hung a little loose on his shoulders now, and the collar scratched his neck, but he had insisted on wearing it because, as he told Jack that morning, a man ought to look the court in the eye. Martha wore Emma's pale blue sweater beneath a dark coat Linda Dawson had lent her. Her silver hair was pinned neatly back, though a few soft strands escaped around her temples, and the wedding ring Ryan had tried to steal rested in her coat pocket like a tiny sun waiting for its hour. Jack Miller walked behind them with Bear at his side. He did not wear medals, did not carry old stories into the room like banners. He wore a plain navy jacket, jeans, and the stillness of a man who knew that sometimes the strongest thing a warrior could do was sit quietly where frightened people could see him. Bear, brushed and calm, moved with solemn dignity, his black and tan coat gleaming beneath the courthouse lights. People turned to look at him, then at Jack, then at the elderly couple walking ahead. No one spoke loudly. Even the walls seemed to know this was not merely a hearing, it was a reckoning. The courtroom was small, with wooden benches polished by decades of anxious hands. At the front sat Judge Margaret Hale, a 70-year-old woman with short white hair, deep brown eyes, and a narrow face made sharper by intelligence rather than cruelty. She had grown up on a dairy farm outside Brattleboro and had spent 40 years on the bench learning that lies often arrived dressed as concern. Her voice, when she greeted the court, was low, measured, and steady enough to make even restless people sit straighter. Ryan Bennett sat at the defense table in a wrinkled gray shirt beneath a cheap blazer that looked borrowed from a better man. His sandy hair had been combed back, but a stubborn lock fell over his forehead, and his rough beard had been trimmed unevenly, as if he believed tidiness alone could make him innocent. Beside him sat David Klein, his appointed attorney, a thin man in his late 30s with pale skin, careful hands, and a tired face that suggested he already knew his client was making the worst version of his job harder. Klein was polite, soft-spoken, and professional, but every time Ryan leaned over to whisper angrily, the attorney's mouth tightened. Rebecca Hayes stood for Harold and Martha with a folder of evidence arranged so precisely it looked almost ceremonial. She wore a charcoal suit, her dark hair smooth against her jaw, and when she rose, the room seemed to sharpen around her. "Your Honor," she began, "Mr. Ryan Bennett will tell this court he was caring for his grandparents. He will use words like responsibility, safety, and confusion. But the evidence will show something very different. Financial exploitation, coercion, unlawful confinement, intimidation, and physical harm." Ryan scoffed, loud enough for the front bench to hear. Judge Hale looked over her glasses. "Mr. Bennett, if you want to testify, there will be a time for that. If you want to perform, find a theater." A faint ripple passed through the room, not quite laughter, but close enough to loosen the fear pressing against Martha's ribs. Rebecca laid out the evidence piece by piece. Doctor. Ellen Price's medical report showed bruises on Martha's wrist and arm inconsistent with a simple fall. Bank statements showed Harold's pension drained in scheduled withdrawals. Property records showed the farmhouse transferred under a so-called care agreement neither Harold nor Martha fully understood. The land sale inquiry revealed Ryan had already begun negotiating with a development company. Then came the photographs, the cold house, the unpaid bills, the door bolted from the outside, The nailed window, the tray with hardened food, the scratches on the floor left by Harold's cane. Each image appeared on the screen beside the judge's bench like a lantern lowered into a cellar. Ryan shifted in his chair, jaw working, anger rising and falling across his face. "They wandered," he snapped when Rebecca mentioned the lock. "They forget things. I was keeping them safe." Judge Hale raised one finger. "You will not interrupt again." Then Rebecca played the recording Martha had hidden. Ryan's own voice filled the room, thick with drink and contempt. "You sign when I tell you to sign. You think anyone's going to believe two confused old fools over me?" Martha's hand flew to her mouth. Harold looked down at the cane between his knees. Jack did not move, but Bear leaned gently against his leg, sensing the pressure of memory in the room. Emma Collins testified next. She looked small at the witness stand, auburn braid over one shoulder, freckles standing out against pale skin, but her voice did not break. She told the court how Harold and Martha had come into the pine lantern soaked, exhausted, and afraid. How Martha's wrist had been bruised, how Ryan's truck had crept past the diner too slowly to be chance. "They didn't look like people running away from help," Emma said. "They looked like people running toward the first place with a light on." Ryan muttered something under his breath. This time, even his attorney touched his sleeve sharply, warning him to stop. Then Harold was called. For a moment he did not rise. Martha squeezed his hand. Jack, seated in the back with Bear, gave the smallest nod. Harold planted his cane, pushed himself upright, and walked to the witness stand with the slow gravity of an old oak refusing to fall in the final storm. His voice trembled at first, but it cleared as he spoke. He told the court about building the porch with his own hands, about trusting Ryan after Laura died, about signing papers because grief and age had made him tired. He spoke of the checkbook disappearing, the phone being taken, neighbors turned away, questions answered with shouting. "He didn't only take our money," Harold said, looking at Ryan for the first time. "He took the way I saw myself. He made me think being old meant being useless. He made me ashamed to need shoes, ashamed to ask about my own pension, ashamed to sit in my own chair too long because it cost heat." The courtroom fell so quiet the snow sliding from the roof outside could almost be heard. "But I was not dead," Harold continued, gripping the rail of the witness stand. "My wife was not dead. We were simply inconvenient to him." Ryan's face reddened, but something in his eyes faltered. The old man he had bullied in kitchens and locked rooms was now speaking before a judge, a town, a dog, and God. Then Martha stood. Rebecca started to help her, but Martha shook her head. She walked slowly to the front and took the wedding ring from her pocket. The gold caught the courtroom light, small but undefeated. "He said this was just metal," she said, her voice soft enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. "I hid it not because it was worth money. I hid it because it was the last thing he had not taken from me." Her fingers closed around the ring. "My husband gave it to me when we had nothing but a rented room and 2 chipped plates. It reminded me I was loved before I was afraid." I needed to remember that. Even Judge Hale's face softened. Ryan looked down. Not in repentance, perhaps, but because truth had finally become too heavy to stare at. When the ruling came, it sounded less like thunder than like a gate opening. Judge Hale voided the property transfer pending final civil processing, ordered immediate restoration of Harold and Martha's occupancy rights, froze disputed accounts, issued a permanent no-contact order against Ryan, and referred the evidence for prosecution on charges of elder abuse, fraud, coercion, and unlawful confinement. "Care does not lock doors from the outside," she said. "Care does not forge signatures, drain pensions, or threaten the vulnerable. This court recognizes Harold and Martha Bennett as the rightful occupants and protected parties of their home." Martha wept then, openly, without shame. Harold bowed his head over his cane, shoulders shaking once before he steadied. Ryan was led away, not roaring now, not grand, only smaller than the fear he had built. Outside the courthouse, winter air met them clean and bright. Reporters stood near the steps, townspeople lingered in quiet clusters, and Emma wiped her eyes with both hands, laughing at herself because she had promised not to cry. Jack said nothing. He did not need to. Bear stepped forward, tail low and gentle, and Martha bent slowly, wrapping both arms around his powerful neck. The dog stood still as a monument, warm and living beneath her cheek. "You didn't just protect us," she whispered. "You helped the whole world see us." Spring did not rush into Maple Ridge. It arrived like an old friend afraid to knock too loudly, melting snow from the rooftops, one silver drop at a time. By April, the frozen banks along County Road 9 had sunk into muddy ribbons. The maple branches had begun to bud, and the Bennett farmhouse stood under a clean blue sky as if waking from a long illness. Its white paint was still chipped in places, the porch still sagged at one corner, and the yard still bore the scars of winter tires and police boots, but the house no longer looked like a place holding its breath. The nailed window had been opened. The outside bolt on the upstairs bedroom door had been ripped away and thrown into a scrap bucket by Jack Miller himself. New handrails lined the staircase, smooth pine sanded beneath Harold Bennett's careful supervision, and sunlight entered the kitchen every morning without asking permission from fear. Harold moved slower now, but not smaller. He wore a plaid shirt rolled to the elbows, his white hair combed neatly. His cane, leaning nearby while he held a hammer in one hand like a scepter, returned to a weary king. The hammer rose only a few inches with each swing, and sometimes Jack had to steady the board for him, but Harold's eyes shone with a light that had not been there in winter. "Don't laugh," Harold said, squinting at a nail that refused to go straight. "This hammer and I used to be legends." Jack, crouched beside the porch steps in a faded work jacket, gave the nail a glance. "The hammer may remember it differently." Harold stared at him for one offended second, then burst into a laugh so dry and bright that even Bear lifted his head from the grass. Martha Bennett stood in the kitchen with flour on her sleeves and sunlight in her silver hair, which she wore pinned in a loose bun that never survived past noon. Her cheeks had regained a little color, and though age still trembled in her hands, fear no longer ruled them. She rolled dough on the counter and cut it into little bone shapes with a cookie cutter Emma Collins had found at a thrift store. The biscuits were for Bear, of course, though Martha pretended to scold him whenever he sat too close to the oven. "Patience, soldier," she told him as he watched the baking tray with the solemn focus of a saint guarding treasure. "Heroes wait their turn." Bear, 5 years old and far too dignified to beg openly, placed one enormous paw on the kitchen threshold and sighed like a misunderstood prince. On the counter sat a round tin painted blue, and on its lid Martha had written in careful white letters, "For our guardian." Emma arrived every Saturday now, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with gossip from Pine Lantern Diner, sometimes simply because the house had become part of her heart. She was still slender, freckled, and quick-moving, her auburn braid often escaping its ribbon by afternoon, but something in her had changed too. The frightened tenderness she had carried that first snowy day had grown into confidence. She no longer apologized before helping. She just helped, as naturally as spring rain finding roots. Tom Walker came from Burlington when he could, carrying tools he barely knew how to use and pretending he had not come mostly for Linda Dawson's coffee cake. He was all sharp elbows, dry jokes, and watchful blue eyes, but Harold liked him because Tom listened to old stories without checking the time. Rebecca Hayes visited less often, buried in new cases, but when she came, she brought envelopes, final papers, clean signatures, and the fierce relief of battles won on paper. Ryan Bennett had been sentenced months earlier, his fraud and abuse laid bare before a court that no longer accepted the costume of family care. His name was not spoken often in the house, not because they feared it, but because some names, once defeated, deserved no chair at the table. One afternoon, the town gathered on the Bennett porch and yard for what Emma called a repair party, and Harold called "too many people touching my tools." Linda Dawson brought lemonade in glass pitchers and wore a yellow cardigan that made her look like someone had invited the sun to sit down. Sheriff Daniel Brooks came by in plain clothes, broad-shouldered and quiet, carrying a box of old brass screws he claimed were officially useless evidence from his garage. Dr. Ellen Price brought a pie and checked Martha's blood pressure with the stern affection of a woman who knew healing needed both medicine and stubborn friends. Neighbors who had once looked away now painted railings, carried lumber, weeded flower beds, and lowered their eyes when Martha thanked them, ashamed of winter's silence but grateful for the chance to answer differently in spring. At Pine Lantern Diner, Emma had hung a framed photograph near the register. It showed Bear standing beside Jack in the courthouse sunlight, Martha's arms wrapped around the dog's neck, Harold behind them with one hand over his heart. Beneath it, in Emma's neat handwriting, were the words, "The dog who saw what everyone else missed." Customers stopped to read it. Some smiled. Some cried quietly into coffee. A few older couples reached for each other's hands without saying why. Late that day, when the repaired porch glowed gold under the lowering sun, Harold tapped his cane twice against the boards and cleared his throat. The yard quieted. Even Bear, halfway through accepting a biscuit from Martha, paused with heroic sacrifice. Harold stood at the porch rail he had helped sand, shoulders bent but spirit upright, and looked out at Jack, Emma, Linda, Tom, Rebecca, Sheriff Brooks, Dr. Price, and the neighbors who had filled the yard with noise, sweat, and second chances. "I spent my life building houses," Harold said, his voice rough but steady. "I used to think a home was wood, nails, roof pitch, good drainage, and a porch rail that didn't wobble when a man leaned on it after a long day." A few people chuckled softly. Harold smiled, then his eyes grew wet. "I was wrong. This house was not saved by lumber. It was saved by a stranger who stopped when stopping was inconvenient, by a young woman who brought soup when fear had emptied our stomachs, by a widow who opened a door without asking us to explain our shame, by a lawyer who was not afraid of a bully with papers, by a sheriff who knew evidence could speak for the frightened, and by a dog who never turned his face away from pain." Martha pressed a hand to her mouth. Jack looked down, uncomfortable with praise, as if gratitude were weather he had no training for. Bear trotted to Harold and sat beside him, tail brushing the porch boards. Harold placed one shaking hand on the dog's head. "This old house is ours again," he said. "But more than that, our lives are ours again." No one clapped at first. The silence was too full. Then Linda began, slow and strong, and soon the whole yard joined, applause rising into the spring air like bells after a long siege. As evening settled, people drifted home with paint on their sleeves and pie wrapped in napkins. Jack loaded his toolbox into the truck, Bear waiting beside him. He had planned to leave quietly. That was his habit. Do the work, avoid the ceremony, disappear before anyone tried to call him a hero. But Martha came down the porch steps and caught his hand. Her grip was firmer now, warm from the kitchen, dusted faintly with flour. "Son," she said. The word struck him harder than any battlefield sound. Jack looked at her, throat tightening. Martha's blue eyes shone with tears, but there was peace in them. "You gave us back more than a house." Jack tried to answer and failed. Bear pressed his head against Martha's leg, and she bent to kiss the fur between his ears. "And you," she whispered to him, "you finished your mission." The German shepherd leaned into her touch, calm and certain, as if he had known all along that every storm was only a road toward this porch, this light, this laughter through open windows. Jack looked at the house, at Harold waving from the doorway, at Emma carrying the blue biscuit tin inside, at the maple tree budding above the yard. For the first time in years, he felt the old war inside him loosen its fist. He understood then that a soldier did not always need a battlefield to serve. Sometimes the mission was a trembling hand outside a diner. Sometimes it was a locked room opened. Sometimes it was simply refusing to look away. As Jack and Bear walked toward the truck, spring sunlight spilled across Maple Ridge, and behind them, the Bennett house stood open, warm, and alive again. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, shining skies, or voices from heaven. Sometimes they come quietly through a stranger who stops, a loyal dog who senses pain, and a small act of kindness offered before anyone asks. The story of Jack, Bear, Harold, and Martha reminds us that God can work through ordinary hands, tired hearts, warm soup, open doors, and the courage to see people others have forgotten. In daily life, we may pass someone carrying a silent storm. A gentle word, a shared meal, or simply refusing to look away can become the miracle they were praying for. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and subscribe for more stories of faith, love, and compassion. May God bless you, your family, and every soul still waiting to be seen.